standards? Well, that just represents sound institutional planning and respect for student safety protocols. The Galactic Defense Institute on Kepler Prime represented the pinnacle of interstellar military education, a gleaming monument to bureaucratic overconfidence wrapped in chrome and self-congratulation. Its spires reached toward 3 different suns, each one casting shadows that somehow managed to look pretentious. Here, the galaxy's finest minds gathered to learn the art of warfare, threat assessment, and the delicate science of not accidentally starting diplomatic incidents while pointing weapons at things. Professor ZY Exthal adjusted his crystalline form behind the podium, light refracting through his translucent body in patterns that suggested either deep contemplation or mild indigestion. The morning's lecture hall buzzed with the particular energy of students who had stayed up too late studying and were now mainlining stimulants to appear alert. 57 cadets from 23 different species filled the tiered seating, their various appendages poised over data tablets, ready to absorb wisdom about identifying and neutralizing threats to galactic peace. What none of them realized, of course, was that the most dangerous predator in known space was sitting in the 3rd row, quietly doodling geometric patterns in her notebook margin and wondering if the cafeteria would serve those little blue pastries again at lunch. Today, Professor ZY Exthal began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never actually seen combat, but had read extensively about it. We delve into perhaps the most critical subject in modern threat assessment, identifying and understanding human behavioral patterns. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional representation of a standard human male. The figure rotated slowly, as if being examined for purchase, while data streams cascaded down both sides of the image. Average height, 1.8 meters. Average weight, 80 kilograms. Average lethality, catastrophic. Humans, the professor continued, warming to his favorite subject, represent a unique challenge in galactic security. They are, by all conventional wisdom, utterly unremarkable. No natural armor, no venomous appendages, no electromagnetic manipulation abilities. Yet somehow, in the mere 3 centuries since first contact, they have managed to establish themselves as the single most militarily successful species in the known galaxy. A Zentri cadet in the front row raised one of her 4 arms. Professor, how is that possible? They seem so fragile. Professor ZY Exthal's crystalline structure brightened with what might have been amusement. Ah, Cadet Vexnari, you have identified the central paradox of human behavior. They are indeed fragile. By most standards, a well-placed claw swipe could theoretically incapacitate one. Yet this apparent weakness masks a psychological profile so uniquely dangerous that the Galactic Council has classified detailed human behavioral analysis as Level 7 restricted information. In the 3rd row, the human cadet, let us call her Cadet Chen, though that wasn't remotely her real name, nearly choked on her morning stimulant. Level 7? They had classified basic human psychology as Level 7. She had cousins back on Earth who weren't cleared for Level 7 information. The key to understanding human lethality, the professor explained, manipulating the hologram to highlight the human brain, lies in their neural architecture. Humans possess what xenopsychologists term adaptive aggression syndrome. Unlike most species, which display predictable threat responses, humans exhibit a disturbing tendency to become more dangerous when injured, cornered, or facing impossible odds. The hologram shifted to show a battlefield scenario. Human soldiers, vastly outnumbered, were somehow winning through what appeared to be sheer bloody-mindedness and an alarming disregard for personal safety. Note the tactical patterns. Professor ZY Exthal continued. Most rational species would retreat when facing 3-to-1 odds. Humans, inexplicably, tend to interpret such circumstances as exciting challenges. Military historians are still debating whether this represents evolved strategy or collective mental illness. Cadet Chen had to bite her lip to avoid laughing. Exciting challenges? During her last deployment with the Terran Special Operations Division, they had called 4-to-1 odds Tuesday. The professor was describing her last 3 missions as signs of species-wide psychological dysfunction. Furthermore, the professor said, now pacing in that way academics do when they sense their audience's attention beginning to wander, humans demonstrate unprecedented pack bonding behaviors. While most species form alliances based on genetic similarity or resource sharing, humans will apparently risk their lives for individuals they have known for minimal periods, sometimes based solely on shared hardship or common purpose. The hologram now showed human soldiers carrying wounded comrades through hostile terrain, displaying the kind of loyalty that made military planners across the galaxy break out in nervous sweats. This bonding extends beyond their own species, Professor ZY Exthal noted, his voice dropping to the tone usually reserved for discussing dangerous mental illnesses. Humans have been observed forming protective attachments to almost any life form, including species that would normally be considered prey, predator, or in some cases, lunch. There are documented cases of humans risking combat operations to rescue trapped civilians of species they had never encountered before. A Krillian cadet near the back raised a tentacle. Professor, surely that is tactically disadvantageous. Why would evolution favor such behavior? An excellent question, Cadet Mordock. The prevailing theory is that human evolution occurred under circumstances so consistently hostile that their ancestors developed what we might call crisis bonding as a survival mechanism. When your species evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill you every moment of every day, apparently the logical response is to form unbreakable alliances with anything that isn't immediately attempting to eat you. Cadet Chen reflected on this assessment. Earth was trying to kill them? She supposed that was technically true. What with the hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, poisonous animals, diseases, and that unfortunate period when their ancestors had to worry about being stepped on by creatures the size of buildings. Still, it seemed a bit dramatic when put that way. But perhaps most dangerous of all, Professor ZY Exthal continued, his crystalline form now pulsing with what his species displayed during moments of particular emphasis, is the human capacity for what they term creative problem-solving. When faced with obstacles, most species attempt to overcome them through application of superior force, advanced technology, or tactical maneuvering. Humans, disturbingly, tend to approach problems from directions that other species would never consider. The hologram shifted again, now showing a historical recreation of the Battle of Kepler-7, where a human commander had ended a 3-month siege by launching her soldiers through space in improvised projectile pods, turning her troops into living artillery rounds. It had been tactically insane, strategically brilliant, and absolutely terrifying to witness. They call it thinking outside the box, the professor explained. Military analysts call it weaponized creativity. The end result is that human tactical responses are nearly impossible to predict because they frequently violate the basic assumptions of logical warfare. Cadet Chen remembered that battle, though from a rather different perspective than the one being presented. She had been one of those living artillery rounds, and the experience had been significantly less poetic and significantly more terrifying than the hologram suggested. Still, it had worked, which was really the only metric that mattered when people were shooting at you. Now, Professor ZY Exthal announced, we move to practical identification techniques. How does one spot a potential human threat in a civilian population? The hologram shifted to show various human figures in everyday situations. The professor began highlighting specific behavioral markers with laser pointer precision. First, observe their movement patterns. Humans demonstrating military training will exhibit what xenopsychologists term tactical awareness. They position themselves with clear sight lines to exits, avoid standing with their backs to open spaces, and demonstrate unconscious threat assessment behaviors. As he spoke, the hologram highlighted a human in a crowded marketplace who was indeed doing exactly these things. Cadet Chen realized with some amusement that she was currently positioned with a clear view of both classroom exits, had automatically catalogued the weapon's potential of every object within reach, and had been conducting continuous threat assessments on her classmates for the past 4 months. Second, examine their social interaction patterns. Military-trained humans often display heightened protective instincts toward perceived civilians, particularly those they identify as vulnerable. They may unconsciously position themselves between potential threats and non-combatants. Cadet Chen glanced around the classroom and realized she had indeed been unconsciously categorizing her classmates as protected persons. The young Zenthari cadet who always sat in the front row, the elderly Visanian professor who taught xenobiology, the nervous Krillian who jumped at loud noises, yes, she had been mentally filing them all under people who would need looking after if things went sideways. Third, and perhaps most telling, observe their responses to tactical discussions. Civilian humans typically react to descriptions of combat with discomfort, curiosity, or detached interest. Military-trained humans, however, often display what we term professional evaluation. They assess tactical scenarios not as abstract concepts but as practical problems requiring solutions. The professor paused for effect, his crystalline structure refracting the ambient light in patterns that suggested deep satisfaction with his own expertise. For our next exercise, I want each of you to review the tactical scenarios I am about to present and identify which responses indicate potential human military training versus civilian background. The hologram began cycling through various scenarios: humans responding to emergency situations, humans in group dynamics, humans faced with tactical problems. For each scenario, multiple response options were presented, and the cadets were expected to identify which responses indicated military training. Cadet Chen watched her classmates earnestly taking notes, completely failing to identify the correct responses roughly 60% of the time. They consistently chose the most obviously aggressive options as indicative of military training, apparently operating under the assumption that soldiers spent their time growling and flexing menacingly at problems. Cadet Vex Nari, the professor called, in Scenario 12. Which response pattern suggests advanced tactical training? The Zenthari cadet consulted her notes. The human who immediately began shouting orders and positioning himself prominently in the center of the situation. Incorrect. Professor ZY Exthal replied with the patient tone of someone explaining the obverse to the obtuse. The correct answer is the human who moved quietly to the edges of the situation, assessed all participants and exit routes, and only took action after completing a comprehensive threat evaluation. Trained humans rarely announce their capabilities unnecessarily. Cadet Chen had to admire the professor's accuracy on that point. She had spent years learning to blend in, to assess situations without drawing attention, to project competence without advertising capability. The loudest person in the room was rarely the most dangerous one. Now, the professor continued, we move to perhaps the most critical aspect of human threat identification, recognizing their decision-making patterns under pressure. A new series of scenarios began playing, showing humans in high-stress situations. The professor began pointing out subtle behavioral cues that indicated tactical thinking versus civilian panic responses. Note the breathing patterns, the eye movement, the way they position their hands. Trained humans maintain what they call situational awareness even under extreme stress. They continue processing tactical information and evaluating options when most species would be overwhelmed by fight-or-flight responses. As the professor spoke, Cadet Chen realized she was unconsciously demonstrating every single behavior pattern he was describing. Her breathing was controlled. Her eyes were continuously scanning for threats and opportunities. Her hands were positioned for quick movement. And she had been maintaining tactical awareness, so automatically she hadn't even noticed she was doing it. The key insight, Professor ZY Exthal explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone revealing profound wisdom, is that humans do not simply train for combat. They fundamentally rewire their neurological responses to treat potentially lethal situations as solvable problems rather than existential crises. A Visanian cadet raised a question. Professor, how does one actually identify such individuals in practice? These behavioral patterns seem quite subtle. An excellent question, Cadet Threlvana. In practical terms, the most reliable identification method is direct observation during crisis scenarios. However, there are certain interactive techniques that can reveal tactical thinking patterns. Professor ZY Exthal manipulated the holographic display to show a classroom setup similar to their own. For instance, one might present a theoretical tactical problem and observe the responses. Civilian humans typically approach such problems abstractly, focusing on general principles or ethical considerations. Military-trained humans, however, tend to immediately begin asking specific questions about available resources, terrain features, enemy capabilities, and operational constraints. The professor paused, scanning the classroom with what might have been pride in his pedagogical approach. In fact, let us conduct a practical demonstration. I will present a tactical scenario, and we will observe how each of you approaches the problem. This will help you understand the difference between academic analysis and operational thinking. Cadet Chen felt a sudden spike of what humans called "oh shit" awareness. This was heading in a direction that was going to make her morning significantly more complicated. The scenario, Professor Z.Y. Exthal announced, is as follows. A human military unit has occupied a fortified position on high ground. They have established overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes, and defensive positions that maximize their advantages while minimizing their exposure to return fire. Your mission is to dislodge them with minimal casualties to your own forces. What is your approach? Hands shot up around the classroom. The professor began calling on cadets, who offered various responses ranging from overwhelming firepower to lengthy siege tactics to diplomatic negotiation. Each answer prompted detailed analysis from the professor about why such approaches would be problematic when dealing with humans, who had an unfortunate tendency to become more creative and dangerous the longer they had to prepare, and who viewed overwhelming odds as interesting puzzles rather than insurmountable obstacles. The fundamental challenge, Professor Z.Y. Exthal explained after rejecting the seventh consecutive suggestion, is that humans in defensive positions do not think like other species. They do not simply hold their ground and wait. They actively use preparation time to develop contingency plans, create new tactical options, and find ways to turn defensive positions into offensive opportunities. More hands went up. More suggestions were offered and systematically demolished by the professor's analysis of human tactical psychology. Remember, he continued, humans are the species that invented the concept of tactical withdrawal, which is essentially a method of retreating in such a way that your enemy wishes you had stayed and fought instead. They have turned every aspect of warfare, including losing, into a weapon. Cadet Chen was finding the analysis simultaneously flattering and concerning. Yes, humans were tactically creative, but the professor was describing them like they were some sort of military demigods rather than people who had simply learned to be very good at solving problems that involved other people trying to kill them. Perhaps, Professor Z.Y. Exthal mused, we need to think about this differently. Rather than approaching this as a conventional tactical problem, we should consider what makes human defensive positions so uniquely challenging. He paused, scanning the room with the expression of someone preparing to deliver profound wisdom. Does anyone have insights into the psychological factors that make human defensive strategies so difficult to counter? The classroom fell silent. Cadets glanced at each other, clearly struggling with a problem that existed outside their normal academic framework. Anyone? The professor prompted. What psychological advantages do humans possess in defensive scenarios? More silence. Cadet Chen could feel the weight of 56 pairs of eyes, or eye equivalents, waiting for someone to break the increasingly awkward quiet. She looked around the room at her classmates, all of whom were earnestly trying to analyze the tactical psychology of a species they had never actually interacted with, based on theoretical frameworks that were apparently classified at levels most of them would never be cleared for. The irony was overwhelming. Here was a room full of the galaxy's brightest military minds, spending months learning to identify and counter human tactics, while a human sat among them taking notes on their complete misunderstanding of human behavior. She thought about the past 4 months she had spent at the Institute. 4 months of listening to lectures about human pack bonding, while forming genuine friendships with her classmates. 4 months of hearing about human tactical creativity, while watching aliens struggle with problems she could solve in her sleep. 4 months of being described as a uniquely dangerous threat while helping her study group with their assignments and sharing snacks from her care packages from home. Professor Z.Y. Exthal was still waiting for responses, his crystalline form beginning to pulse with the patterns his species displayed when experiencing pedagogical frustration. Surely someone has thoughts about this scenario? We have covered human tactical psychology extensively. What insights can you apply to this problem? Cadet Chen looked at the holographic display, showing the tactical problem that had stumped her classmates. It was, she had to admit, a reasonably complex scenario. The defensive position was well designed, taking advantage of terrain and sight lines in ways that would make it costly to assault directly. Of course, there were at least 6 ways she could think of to take that position, 3 of which would probably work with minimal casualties, and 1 of which would be so unexpected that the defenders would likely surrender out of sheer confusion rather than tactical necessity. The professor was still scanning the room hopefully. Anyone? Any thoughts at all about human defensive psychology? Cadet Chen felt the moment stretching out, filled with academic expectation and her classmates' obverse discomfort. She looked around at the earnest faces of her friends, because they were her friends, despite what the professor said about human pack bonding being a tactical advantage rather than genuine affection. Cadet Vexnari was frowning at her notes, clearly trying to find some insight she had missed. Cadet Marduk was staring at the hologram, as if sustained examination might reveal hidden tactical wisdom. The young Krillian cadet who sat near her was actually trembling slightly with what she recognized as academic anxiety. These were good people. Decent people. They were trying their best to understand something that was, admittedly, rather outside their experience. And they were getting it wrong in ways that were both amusing and slightly concerning. The professor was beginning to look like he might start calling on students randomly, which would only increase their stress levels. Cadet Chen made a decision that she was probably going to regret. She raised a hand. The effect was immediate and profound. Professor Zyxthal's crystalline structure brightened with relief and anticipation. Yes, Cadet. He paused, consulting his roster with the expression of someone who had just realized he might have overlooked a particularly promising student. Chen, she supplied helpfully. Cadet Chen, yes. Please, share your analysis of the scenario. 56 pairs of eyes, or eye equivalents, turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to gratitude that someone was finally going to break the silence. Cadet Chen stood, as protocol required, and looked at the holographic display showing the tactical problem that had puzzled her classmates. Well, she began, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing a mildly interesting puzzle rather than a life-or-death military scenario. The first thing you have to understand about humans in defensive positions is that we tend to get bored easily. The word "we" hung in the air like a small explosive device. Professor Zyxthal's crystalline form went completely still. The kind of stillness that preceded either enlightenment or complete system failure. "We?" he asked, his voice carrying a note that suggested his species' equivalent of rising panic. "Humans," Cadet Chen clarified, as if that explained everything. Which, of course, it did. The classroom erupted in what could generously be described as controlled chaos. Several cadets jumped in their seats. Others made sounds that probably translated as expressions of shock in their respective languages. The Krillian near her made a noise like a deflating balloon and slid under his desk. Professor Zyxthal's crystalline structure began cycling through colors that definitely indicated system failure. You're a human," he managed. "Yes," Cadet Chen replied patiently. "I have been for quite some time now. Also, I've been attending your lectures for 4 months." The professor's form flickered through several more colors, settling on what appeared to be his species' equivalent of the blue screen of death. But our screening protocols, our security measures, our threat assessment procedures are apparently not as comprehensive as you might have hoped, Cadet Chen observed. Though in fairness, your basic analysis of human tactical psychology is reasonably accurate. You just tend to overcomplicate the applications. She gestured toward the holographic display, which was still showing the tactical problem that had stumped the class. For instance, this scenario. You're all thinking about it as if the humans in the defensive position are going to sit there and wait for you to figure out how to attack them. But humans don't really do passive defense. If we're holding a position, we're probably planning to use it as a base for offensive operations, or as bait for some kind of trap, or we've already identified 17 different ways to turn your attack into an opportunity for counterattack. Professor Zyxthal made a sound that might have been his species' equivalent of whimpering. Also, Cadet Chen continued helpfully, you keep talking about human pack bonding like it's some kind of tactical calculation, but it's really just that we're like people. I mean, look at this class. You've spent 4 months teaching us how dangerous and unpredictable humans are, and I've spent 4 months helping half of you with your assignments and sharing my snacks with the other half. She gestured toward her classmates, most of whom were staring at her with expressions that suggested they were recalculating everything they thought they knew about reality. Cadet Marduk, remember when you were struggling with the xenobiology coursework, and I spent 3 evenings explaining mammalian biochemistry to you? That wasn't tactical pack bonding. That was just being friendly. The Krillian cadet slowly emerged from under his desk, tentacles trembling. Vexnari, Chen continued, when you were homesick last month and I brought you those chocolate things from the human cuisine section of the cafeteria. That wasn't adaptive threat management. That was just noticing you looked sad and wanting to help." The Zenthari cadet made a sound that was probably her species equivalent of nervous laughter. "The thing is," Chen said, addressing the professor directly, "your threat assessment isn't wrong. Exactly. Humans can be dangerous. We are creative problem solvers, we do bond with other species, and we do tend to treat impossible situations as interesting challenges rather than reasons to give up." Professor ZYXTHAL's crystalline form had stabilized into what was probably his species' version of fascinated horror. "But," Chen continued, "you're missing the most important point about human psychology." "Which is," the professor managed. Chen smiled, an expression that probably looked quite different when viewed through the lens of potentially lethal predator species rather than helpful classmate who shared study notes. "We really don't want to be threats. The reason humans are so good at warfare isn't because we like fighting, it's because we want fighting to stop. We're creative tacticians because we want conflicts to end quickly and decisively, with as few people getting hurt as possible. We bond with other species because we genuinely like diversity and interesting perspectives." She paused, looking around the classroom at her friends, and they were her friends, regardless of what the professor said about tactical psychology. "The most dangerous thing about humans isn't that we're good at violence. It's that we're much better at friendship than most species expect. We don't want to conquer the galaxy, we want to be part of it." The classroom was silent except for the faint humming of the holographic projectors, and what might have been Professor ZYXTHAL experiencing the educational equivalent of an existential crisis. "Although," Chen added thoughtfully, "your security protocols really are terrible. I've been here for 4 months, and nobody thought to run a basic DNA scan? I mean, I filled out all the forms honestly. My species designation is right there in my admission paperwork." Professor ZYXTHAL made a sound like a crystal wind chime falling downstairs. You filled out your paperwork honestly." "Of course. Why would I lie? I'm here to learn about galactic defense strategies. Earth is a member of the Galactic Council. We want to contribute to collective security efforts." The professor's form began cycling through colors again, this time in patterns that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid and fundamental revision. But the security implications, the classification levels, the threat assessments might need some updating, Chen agreed. "Though I have to say, your analysis of human tactical creativity is spot on. You just need to remember that creativity isn't the same thing as hostility." She turned to address her classmates, who were still staring at her with expressions ranging from amazement to terror. "For what it's worth, you're all terrible at spotting human behavioral patterns. I've been demonstrating classic tactical awareness behaviors for months, and none of you noticed. We thought you were just really alert," Cadet Vexnari said weakly. "And when you kept helping us with our assignments, we assumed you were naturally generous," added Cadet Morduk. "And when you shared your food with everyone, we thought it was cultural hospitality," contributed the Krillian cadet. Chen nodded approvingly. "See? That's exactly what I mean about human psychology. All of those things were tactical behaviors, but they were also genuine friendship behaviors. That's what makes humans hard to predict. We're usually being tactically aware and sincerely friendly simultaneously." Professor ZYXTHAL had apparently reached some kind of decision, because his crystalline form was now pulsing with patterns that suggested either acceptance or complete surrender to the absurdity of the situation. "So," he said slowly, "if you were to approach the tactical scenario I presented, what would your solution be?" Chen looked at the holographic display again, considering the problem with the kind of practical attention that 4 months of theoretical instruction had taught her to recognize as distinctly human. "Well," she said, "the first thing I do is check if they want to surrender. Humans in defensive positions are usually there because they have to be, not because they want to fight. If you offer them a face-saving way to resolve the situation without bloodshed, they'll probably take it." The professor made a note with shaking crystalline appendages. "And if they don't want to surrender?" "Then I'd probably wait until they got bored and came out to attack me," Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Like I said, humans don't like passive defense. Give us a few days in a fortified position, and we'll start getting creative about offensive operations." Much easier to deal with humans when they are moving than when they are dug in. More frantic note-taking from the professor. And if time constraints prevent a waiting strategy? Chen shrugged. Then I'd do something unexpected enough that they'd have to spend time figuring out how to respond, which would create opportunities for tactical exploitation. Humans are good at adapting to new situations, but adaptation takes time, and time creates vulnerabilities. She looked around the classroom, noting her classmates' expressions of dawning comprehension. The key to understanding human tactics isn't to treat us like some kind of incomprehensible alien intelligence. We're actually pretty straightforward. We want to solve problems, we want to protect people we care about, and we want conflicts to end as quickly and cleanly as possible. Work with those motivations instead of against them, and humans become much more predictable. Professor Zyxthal's note-taking had reached the point where it might more accurately be described as frantic documentation of personal and professional crisis. This, he said slowly, is going to require significant revision of our entire curriculum. Probably, Chen agreed. Though your basic framework is sound. You just need to remember that tactical capability doesn't necessarily indicate hostile intent. Most humans would much rather be your friends than your enemies. She paused, considering. Also, you might want to update your screening procedures. I'm flattered that you think humans are so dangerous that my presence here represents a massive security breach, but I'm really just a graduate student trying to learn about interstellar defense coordination. The professor looked at her, with what might have been the beginning of professional curiosity overcoming existential panic. Graduate student in what field? Xenopsychology, Chen replied cheerfully, with a focus on interspecies military cooperation. My thesis is on improving human integration into galactic defense structures. Professor Zyxthal made the sound that crystalline beings make when they realize the universe has a sense of humor, and they are currently serving as its primary entertainment. You're studying us while we're studying you. More or less, Chen confirmed. Though your approach is more theoretical, while mine is more participatory. The professor was quiet for a moment, his crystalline form cycling through what were probably the colors of deep thought, professional recalculation, and possibly the early stages of academic excitement. Would you, he asked carefully, be willing to serve as a guest lecturer for the remainder of the course? Chen considered this. On one hand, it would completely blow her cover for the participant-observer research she had been conducting. On the other hand, her classmates were never going to look at her the same way again anyway, and helping them understand human psychology from a primary source perspective would probably be more educational than continuing to pretend to take notes on their misconceptions. Sure, she said. Though I should probably mention that I'm not exactly a typical human. I am special operations qualified, so I might be a bit more tactically oriented than your average human civilian. Professor Zyxthal's crystalline form went very, very still. Special operations qualified. Terran Defense Corps, Special Operations Division, Xenocontact Specialist, Chen confirmed. Which, now that I think about it, probably explains why I passed your screening procedures. Blending in with alien populations is literally what I'm trained to do. The professor made a sound like breaking glass. You're not just a human. You're a human special operations soldier. Well, yes, but I'm off duty, Chen said reasonably. I'm here as a graduate student, not as military personnel. Off duty, the professor repeated faintly. Academic sabbatical, technically. Though I suppose you could say I've been conducting unofficial reconnaissance on galactic military education standards. Professor Zyxthal's form began flickering through colors at a rate that suggested either impending enlightenment or complete system failure. And your assessment of our educational standards? Chen looked around the classroom at her classmates, who were hanging on every word of this conversation with the fascination of people watching their understanding of reality undergo real-time revision. Honestly, pretty good, overall. Your theoretical framework for human psychology is remarkably accurate. You just need more practical application and maybe some input from actual humans. She paused, considering. Also, your screening procedures definitely need work, but I suspect you've already figured that out. The professor managed what might have been laughter. If crystalline beings could laugh, or possibly the sound of someone's worldview cracking under the weight of irony. Indeed, he managed. I believe this experience has been educational for all involved. Chen smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth despite the tactical considerations that were probably still operating in the back of her mind. That's what education is for, right? Learning new things about the universe and our place in it. She looked around the classroom again, taking in the faces of her friends and fellow students. Besides, now you all have a much better understanding of practical human behavior patterns. For instance, the fact that I just spent 20 minutes explaining human psychology instead of, say, taking you all hostage or calling for backup, probably tells you something about how humans actually respond to unexpected social situations. Which is, asked Cadet Vexnari. We try to be helpful, Chen replied. Even when the situation is tactically disadvantageous, even when we're confused or surprised, even when we're not sure what's going to happen next. We try to solve problems and help people understand each other. Professor ZY Exthal had apparently processed the full implications of the morning's revelations, because his crystalline form was now pulsing with patterns that suggested acceptance, professional curiosity, and possibly the early stages of planning a complete curriculum revision. Well, he said, I believe we have all learned something today about the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. He looked directly at Chen, his expression carrying what might have been respect, academic interest, and a healthy dose of amused bewilderment. Cadet Chen, would you be available tomorrow to begin our revised curriculum with a lecture on practical human psychology, a primary source perspective? Chen considered this, mentally reviewing her class schedule, her thesis timeline, and the probability that her presence here was going to generate a truly impressive amount of paperwork for various bureaucratic entities. Absolutely, she said. Though I should probably warn you that once word gets out that you've got an actual human teaching human psychology, you're going to have requests from every xenopsychology department in the galaxy. Professor ZY Exthal's crystalline form brightened with what was unmistakably academic ambition. I certainly hope so, he said. And so it was that the Galactic Defense Institute's most popular course became Practical Xenopsychology, Understanding Humans Through Direct Interaction, taught jointly by Professor ZY Exthal and guest lecturer Chen, whose real name remained classified, but whose insights into human tactical psychology revolutionized threat assessment training across 17 star systems. The irony, of course, was that the most effective way to neutralize the human threat turned out to be treating humans as friends and colleagues rather than opponents. But then again, perhaps that had been the point all along. After all, the most dangerous thing about humans wasn't their capacity for violence. It was their capacity for turning enemies into allies through the simple expedient of being genuinely, tactically, and inexplicably decent to people who probably didn't deserve it. Which, when you thought about it, was a pretty effective threat neutralization strategy, even if it did require completely rewriting the textbooks.